The burgundy dress hugged Julia's curves perfectly, its silk fabric catching the soft glow of the bedside lamp as she adjusted the neckline one final time. She'd bought this dress 3 weeks ago specifically for tonight, spending more than she usually would on a single piece of clothing, but their 10th wedding anniversary deserved something special. The deep wine color complemented her auburn hair and brought out the green in her hazel eyes. At least, that's what the sales associate at Nordstrom had told her when she'd hesitated over the price tag. 10 years of marriage deserved celebration, and she had chosen this dress specifically for tonight. Their anniversary dinner at Chez Laurent, the same French restaurant where Michael had proposed all those years ago. The memory of that night was still vivid in her mind. Michael, nervous and stumbling over his words as he got down on one knee beside their table, the other diners breaking into spontaneous applause when she said yes, the way her hands had shaken so badly she could barely hold the champagne glass he'd ordered to celebrate. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now 38, the same age her mother had been when she'd warned Julia about settling too, quickly. "Make sure you really know who he is before you say I do," her mother had cautioned during their engagement party. People can hide their true selves for years if they're motivated enough. Julia had dismissed the advice as her mother's typical pessimism, a byproduct of her own difficult divorce when Julia was in college. "You look beautiful," she whispered to her reflection, applying one last coat of the deep red lipstick that Michael used to say made her look like a movie star. Those compliments had become scarce lately, buried under the weight of his demanding job at the investment firm and her own career as a marketing director for a boutique agency. But tonight would be different. Tonight, they would remember why they fell in love in that crowded coffee shop near the University of Washington campus, where she'd been struggling with her laptop and he'd offered to help fix her presentation, slides. She'd planned this evening meticulously over the past month, even going so far as to book a weekend getaway to the San Juan Islands for the following month. The reservation confirmation was tucked safely in her purse, a surprise she planned to reveal over dessert. She'd researched the best whale-watching tours, found a charming bed and breakfast that served organic farm-to-table breakfasts, and even packed a bottle of the wine they'd shared on their honeymoon in Tuscany. The trip would cost more than they usually spent on vacations, but some investments in their relationship were worth making. The drive to downtown Seattle was filled with anticipation and the kind of nervous energy she hadn't felt in years. Julia had spent weeks planning this evening, coordinating with the restaurant to ensure they got their old table, arranging for her assistant to handle any work emergencies that might arise, and even getting her hair done that afternoon at the expensive salon in Bellevue Square. The city lights twinkled through the windshield of her silver BMW, each one seeming to promise that this anniversary would mark a new beginning for their marriage, a return to the connection they'd somehow lost in the day-to-day grind of careers and responsibilities. Chez Laurent hadn't changed much since their engagement night a decade ago, and walking through its doors felt like stepping back in time. The same warm amber lighting cast dancing shadows across white tablecloths that were pressed to crisp perfection, and the familiar scent of garlic, fresh herbs, and expensive wine filled the air with promises of romance and sophistication. The maitre d' was different, a younger man with a practiced smile and an impeccable French accent that was probably acquired in drama school rather than Paris, but the atmosphere remained timelessly elegant. Julia spotted Michael immediately. His tall, athletic frame, unmistakable even in the crowded restaurant filled with other couples celebrating their own special occasions. He was already seated at their usual corner table, the one with a perfect view of Elliott Bay, where ferries glided back and forth like elegant white swans against the darkening water. He was wearing the navy suit she'd bought him for his last promotion, paired with the silver tie she'd given him for his birthday. The sight of him in clothes she'd chosen with such care now felt like a cruel irony. "Sorry, I'm late," Julia said, slightly breathless from hurrying in her heels across the restaurant's polished hardwood floors. Traffic on I-5 was absolutely brutal. There was some kind of accident near the convention center that had everything backed up for miles. Michael looked up from his phone, where he'd been scrolling through what appeared to be work emails even during their anniversary dinner. His expression was unreadable, lacking the warmth or anticipation she'd hoped to see reflected in his dark, brown eyes. "You're not late. I was early." His tone was flat, professional, the same voice he used during conference calls with difficult clients. He didn't compliment her dress, didn't stand to pull out her chair as he used to do during their early dating years when such gestures felt natural rather than performed. Instead, he simply nodded toward the seat across from him with the casual indifference of a business associate. Julia settled into her chair, smoothing her dress and trying to shake off the growing unease that was settling in her chest like a cold weight. The restaurant buzzed with conversation and laughter from other tables, couples leaning in close to share intimate conversations and stolen kisses. The contrast between their obvious happiness and the tension at her own table was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. "This place still looks exactly the same, doesn't it?" Julia tried again, forcing brightness into her voice as she gestured around the dining room. "Remember when you brought me here for your birthday 3 years ago, and the waiter spilled that entire glass of red wine all over that businessman at the next table? The poor man's white shirt was completely ruined, but he was so gracious about it. The manager sent over champagne and dessert to apologize." "I remember." Michael's fingers drummed against the table, a nervous habit she'd noticed becoming more frequent over the past few months, especially during conversations about their relationship or future plans. The sound was rhythmic and irritating, like a countdown timer marking the seconds until something unpleasant would happen. "Julia, we need to talk." The word sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the restaurant's air conditioning. In her experience, conversations that began with, "we need to talk," never ended well. But she forced a smile, determined to salvage what was supposed to be a romantic evening. "Of course we do. It's been forever since we've had a real conversation, just the two of us without work constantly interrupting. Work has been so crazy for both of us lately. I feel like we're ships passing in the night most days." She reached across the table to touch his hand, seeking the physical connection they'd shared for 10 years, but he pulled it away as if her touch burned him. Instead, he reached for a manila envelope that had been sitting beside his water glass like a dinner companion she hadn't noticed. The envelope was thick, official-looking, and completely out of place in the romantic setting she'd carefully orchestrated. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately," Michael continued, his voice taking on the same detached tone he used during his business calls with clients he was about to disappoint. "About us, about our marriage, about what we both want for the future, about whether we're really compatible in the long term." Julia's heart began to race, the champagne she'd been looking forward to forgotten, as dread settled in her stomach. This wasn't how anniversary dinners were supposed to start. Where were the flowers she'd been expecting? The champagne toast to their years together? The romantic reminiscing about their early days together when they couldn't keep their hands off each other? "Michael, what's going on? You're scaring me. This doesn't sound like anniversary conversation." He slid the envelope across the table with surgical precision, his wedding ring, the platinum band she'd spent weeks selecting at Tiffany, catching the light as his fingers released the document. The movement was deliberate, calculated, as if he'd rehearsed it multiple times to achieve maximum impact. The envelope landed in front of her with a soft thud that somehow seemed to echo louder than the ambient restaurant noise. "Open it," he said simply, his voice devoid of emotion. With trembling hands that she couldn't quite control, Julia lifted the envelope's flap. The papers inside were crisp and white, bearing the letterhead of Hartwell and Associates, one of Seattle's most prestigious family law firms, a detail that registered with terrible clarity. She recognized the firm's name from newspaper articles about high-profile divorces, from billboards around the city advertising their services to wealthy clients seeking discreet legal representation. The words at the top of the first page seemed to blur together before snapping into sharp, devastating focus. Petition for dissolution of marriage. The restaurant's ambient noise, clinking glasses, muted conversations punctuated by laughter, the soft jazz music that had seemed so romantic when she'd arrived, faded into a distant hum as Julia stared at the documents. Her own name stared back at her from the legal text, paired with Michael's in a way that made her stomach turn violently. Respondent. Petitioner. Irreconcilable differences. Words that reduce 10 years of shared life, shared dreams, shared struggles into cold legal terminology. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the blood rushing in her ears. "This is our anniversary dinner, Michael. Our 10th anniversary. I know what day it is." His tone remained maddeningly calm, as if they were discussing quarterly reports rather than the destruction of their marriage. "I thought tonight would be appropriate. Symbolic, in a way." Julia looked up from the papers, searching his face for any sign of the man she'd married. The man who used to leave love notes in her coffee mug, who had cried during their wedding vows, who had held her through 3 miscarriages and promised they'd face everything together. That man seemed to have vanished, replaced by this cold stranger across from her. Symbolic of what, exactly? Her voice was getting stronger now, fueled by a growing mixture of shock and anger. Of how cruel you can be. Of how little our marriage means to you. Michael's jaw tightened. "Don't be dramatic, Julia. We both know this hasn't been working for a long time. We're like roommates who happen to share a mortgage. When was the last time we had a real conversation? When was the last time we were intimate? When was the last time either of us was truly happy?" The questions hung in the air like accusations. Julia wanted to argue, to defend their marriage, but the words stuck in her throat because part of her recognized the truth in what he was saying. They had grown distant, their conversations limited to logistics and schedules. Their physical relationship had indeed become sporadic, perfunctory. But she had assumed it was just a rough patch, the kind of challenge every long-term couple faced. "So you decided to handle it like a business transaction?" Julia's voice was rising now, drawing glances from nearby diners. "You couldn't talk to me about how you were feeling. You couldn't suggest counseling? You just went to a lawyer behind my back and had papers drawn up?" "I tried to talk to you," Michael said, his own voice finally showing some emotion. "Remember last month when I said we needed to discuss our future? You said you were too busy with the Morrison campaign to have heavy conversations. Remember in January when I brought up the fact that we never do anything together anymore? You said I was being needy." Julia's mind raced back to those conversations, replaying them with this new, horrible context. She had dismissed his concerns, too focused on work deadlines and client demands to recognize them as cries for help. But that didn't excuse this betrayal, this public humiliation. "So you thought blindsiding me in a restaurant was a better approach?" She laughed bitterly, the sound foreign even to her own ears. "On our anniversary, no less. Did you plan this, Michael? Did you specifically choose tonight to maximize the impact?" Michael's composure finally cracked, and she caught a glimpse of something that might have been guilt in his eyes. I thought it might be easier in a public place, less likely to turn into a screaming match." "Well, congratulations. You've succeeded in humiliating me instead." Julia stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. The envelope and its contents scattered across the table, and she didn't bother to collect them. "I hope Sarah knows what kind of man she's getting." The name slipped out before she could stop it, and Michael's face went pale. How did I find out about your affair?" Julia's voice was now clearly audible to the surrounding tables, but she no longer cared. "Your secretary might want to be more careful about which emails she forwards. Can't wait to start our new life together was particularly touching, by the way." Michael's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. "Julia, it's not. It wasn't supposed to happen like this." "No, I imagine it wasn't. I'm sure you had it all planned out. The perfect exit strategy. But let me tell you something, Michael." She leaned forward, placing her palms flat on the table. "If you think I'm going to make this easy for you, if you think I'm going to quietly disappear so you can play house with your little secretary, you're very, very wrong." Without waiting for a response, Julia turned and walked toward the restaurant's exit, her heels clicking against the floor with each determined step. Behind her, she could hear Michael calling her name, but she didn't look back. The maître d' opened the door for her with a sympathetic expression, and she stepped out into the cool Seattle evening. The valet brought her car around quickly, perhaps sensing her urgency to leave. As she slid behind the wheel, Julia caught sight of herself in the rearview mirror. Her makeup was still perfect, her hair still in place, but her eyes held a hardness that hadn't been there an hour ago. She looked like a woman who had been betrayed, but also like a woman who was planning to fight back. The drive home was a blur of city lights and racing thoughts. Julia's mind ping-ponged between memories of her marriage and strategies for what came next. She thought about the house they'd bought together in Bellevue, the joint bank accounts, the investment portfolio they'd built. Michael might have thought he could orchestrate their divorce like one of his business deals, but he'd underestimated her. The house was dark when she pulled into the driveway, its windows reflecting the streetlights like empty eyes. It had always been their sanctuary, the place where they'd planned to raise children, to grow old together. Now it felt like a mausoleum for dreams that would never come true. Inside, Julia kicked off her heels and poured herself a generous glass of the expensive wine they'd been saving for a special occasion. The irony wasn't lost on her. This was certainly a night she'd remember forever, just not in the way she'd anticipated. She sat at their kitchen island, still in her burgundy dress, and began to process what had just happened. Michael wanted a divorce. He was having an affair with Sarah, his 26-year-old secretary. He had blindsided her in the most cruel way possible, turning what should have been a celebration into a declaration of war. But as the shock began to wear off, Julia felt something unexpected rising within her, a fierce determination that surprised her with its intensity. She wasn't going to let him destroy her. She wasn't going to let him walk away from their marriage without consequences. If Michael wanted to play hardball, she was going to show him what a real game looked like. Julia reached for her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the name she was looking for, Amanda Chen, her college roommate who had become one of Seattle's most feared divorce attorneys. It was nearly 11 o'clock, but Amanda had always been a night owl. "Julia, is everything okay?" Amanda's voice was alert despite the late hour. "No," Julia said, her voice steady for the first time all evening. "Everything is definitely not okay, but it will be. Can you meet me tomorrow morning? I need the best divorce lawyer in Seattle, and I need her to be absolutely ruthless." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "What did Michael do?" "He made the mistake of underestimating me," Julia replied, taking another sip of wine. "And now he's going to learn exactly how expensive that mistake is going to be." Julia hadn't slept. She'd spent the night pacing through their house. Her house now, she corrected herself with grim satisfaction, cataloging assets and making mental notes of everything that would need to be addressed in the divorce proceedings. The expensive artwork they'd collected during their European honeymoon, pieces they'd chosen together in small galleries in Florence and Paris, now seemed like evidence in a legal case rather than cherished memories. The custom furniture she'd selected for their major renovation 3 years ago, spending months researching designers and materials to create the perfect living space, would now need to be appraised and divided. Even the wine collection Michael was so proud of, bottles he'd acquired over years of careful selection, some worth hundreds of dollars each, would become line items in a settlement negotiation. Every room told the story of a marriage that had once seemed permanent and unshakable. The kitchen where they'd cooked dinner together during their first year as newlyweds, laughing over burnt pasta and over-ambitious recipes. The living room where they'd hosted countless dinner parties for friends and colleagues, where they'd watched movies on lazy Sunday afternoons, where they'd talked about having children someday. The master bedroom where they'd shared intimacy and whispered plans for the future, where she'd nursed him through a bout of pneumonia 3 years ago, where they'd grieved together after each of her miscarriages. By 6 a.m, she was showered, dressed in her sharpest business suit. a charcoal gray Armani that made her feel invincible and reminded her of her own professional accomplishments. And sitting at her laptop with a cup of coffee that was stronger than usual and a legal pad covered in notes written in her precise handwriting. She'd already sent 3 carefully worded emails, one to her assistant explaining she'd be coming in late and asking her to reschedule 2 client meetings, one to her boss requesting a personal day for urgent family matters without going into detail, and one to Amanda confirming their 9 o'clock meeting and expressing her gratitude for the emergency appointment. The coffee was helping to clear the fog of exhaustion and shock, but her hands still trembled slightly as she typed. Every few minutes, her phone would buzz with another text from Michael, increasingly desperate messages that ranged from angry demands to pathetic attempts at reconciliation. She'd turned off the notification sounds after the 15th message, but the visual reminders of his name appearing on her screen were almost as jarring. Michael hadn't come home. His absence spoke volumes about his cowardice and confirmed what Julia had suspected. He'd probably spent the night at Sarah's apartment, celebrating what he thought would be an easy victory. The thought made her jaw clench, but it also fueled her resolve. He clearly had no idea who he was dealing with. Amanda Chen's law office occupied the top floor of a sleek downtown building with panoramic views of Puget Sound and the Olympic Mountains beyond. Julia had visited once before, years ago, when Amanda was handling a messy custody case for one of their mutual friends. The waiting area was all leather and glass, designed to intimidate and impress in equal measure, with original artwork on the walls and fresh orchids on every surface. Today, Julia found it comforting, a sign that she'd chosen the right warrior for the battle ahead. The building itself was one of those modern glass towers that had transformed Seattle's skyline over the past decade. All clean lines and reflective, surfaces that caught the morning light and threw it back in brilliant fragments. Julia had always admired the architecture from a distance, never imagining she'd one day be sitting in one of its offices, planning legal strategy against the man she'd once promised to love and honor until death did them part. "You look like hell," Amanda said without preamble as she emerged from her office, extending her arms for a hug. At 42, Amanda had the sharp elegance of someone who had learned to weaponize her intelligence and appearance. Her black hair was pulled into a perfect chignon that probably took her assistant 20 minutes to achieve each morning, and her red suit was clearly custom-tailored to show off her petite but commanding frame. She wore her success-like armor, the kind of woman who could walk into any room and immediately command respect through sheer force of presence. "I feel worse than I look," Julia admitted, accepting the embrace and drawing comfort from her friends. Familiar perfume, something expensive and French that Amanda had worn since law school. "Thank you for seeing me so quickly. I know your schedule is usually booked months in advance." "Are you kidding? After 15 years of friendship, you think I wouldn't drop everything for you?" Amanda gestured toward her office with the same authoritative grace she probably used to direct juries. "Come on, let's talk. I've already had my assistant clear my morning schedule and reschedule 2 client meetings. This is more important." Amanda's office was exactly what Julia expected. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with legal texts, diplomas, and awards covering one wall, and a massive mahogany desk that served as both workspace and psychological barrier. Amanda settled behind it while Julia took one of the client chairs, grateful for the professional distance that made this conversation feel less personal and more strategic. "So," Amanda began, pulling out a fresh legal pad and an expensive pen. "Start from the beginning. What exactly did Michael do?" Julia recounted the previous evening's events in careful detail, watching Amanda's expression grow progressively darker with each revelation. When she finished, Amanda set down her pen and leaned back in her chair, shaking her head slowly. "That calculating bastard," Amanda said finally. "A public restaurant on your anniversary? With papers already drawn up? He's been planning this for months, Julia. This wasn't a spontaneous decision." "I figured as much. The question is, what do we do about it?" Amanda smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. "We make him regret every single decision that led to this moment." Tell me about your finances. Joint accounts, separate accounts, investments, property, debts, everything. For the next 2 hours, Julia provided a comprehensive breakdown of their financial situation, a process that was both therapeutic and infuriating as she realized how much wealth they'd accumulated together over the years. Their primary residence in Bellevue, a 4-bedroom craftsman-style home worth approximately $1.2 million that they'd bought 5 years ago and renovated extensively with Julia's careful attention to detail. The vacation cabin on Lake Chelan that they'd bought 2 years ago for $400,000. A rustic retreat where they'd planned to spend their retirement years hiking and fishing. Investment accounts totaling nearly $800,000, built through years of disciplined saving and smart financial planning that Julia had largely orchestrated. His 401k from 8 years at the investment firm, her 401k from her various marketing positions, stock options from his company that would vest over the next 3 years, her smaller but growing portfolio from her marketing agency work. The numbers were staggering when laid out in black and white, representing decades of shared labor and sacrifice. Julia remembered the early years when they'd lived in a tiny apartment and eaten ramen noodles 3 nights a week to save money for their first house down payment. She thought about the vacations they'd skipped, the expensive dinners they'd foregone, the careful budgeting that had allowed them to build this impressive financial foundation. "What about the business?" Amanda asked, referring to Julia's marketing consultancy that she'd started 5 years ago when she'd grown tired of working for other people and wanted the freedom to choose her own clients and projects. "It's doing well. Better than I ever expected when I started it, honestly. I had 3 major clients last year, and I'm projected to gross about $200,000 this year, which would be my best year yet. It's all in my name, though. Michael never showed any interest in it beyond asking about the monthly revenue numbers." Julia felt a flash of pride as she recounted her business success, something that was entirely her own creation and couldn't be tainted by Michael's betrayal. "Good. That makes it easier to protect," Amanda said, making several notes in her precise legal handwriting. "What about his income? I need exact figures for spousal support calculations. Base salary of $180,000, plus bonuses that usually run another $100,000 to $150,000 annually, depending on his performance and the firm's profitability. He's up for partner at his firm next year, which would mean a significant increase, probably double his current compensation package." Amanda's eyes lit up. Partnership track? Even better. Washington is a community property state, which means everything acquired during the marriage gets split 50-50. But there are exceptions for separate property, and future earning potential can factor into spousal support calculations. Spousal support? Julia hadn't considered that possibility. "Oh yes. You've been married 10 years, which is significant in terms of duration. You have your own business, which is good, but his earning potential is higher and more stable. Depending on how we play this, you could be looking at several years of spousal maintenance." Julia felt a spark of satisfaction. "What about the affair?" Washington is a no-fault divorce state, so technically the affair doesn't matter for property division or spousal support, but it can matter for other things. Amanda's smile turned predatory. "Tell me about Sarah. How long has this been going on?" "I'm not entirely sure. I found the first suspicious email about 6 weeks ago, but they could have been involved longer. She's his secretary, 26 years old, been working at his firm for about 8 months. A secretary 26 years old." Amanda wrote this down with obvious relish. How cliché can he get? And how spectacularly stupid, considering she's a subordinate employee. His firm won't like that at all. Most investment companies have strict fraternization policies, especially between supervisors and support staff. You think his job could be at risk? Let's just say that information might be useful as leverage. Companies don't like sexual harassment lawsuits, and an affair between a supervisor and his secretary can create all sorts of liability issues. Amanda paused, studying Julia's face. "How ruthless do you want to get with this, Julia? I need to know your limits before we proceed." Julia thought about Michael's cold smile as he slid those papers across the table, about the months of planning that had gone into humiliating her in the most cruel way possible, about Sarah's smug email references to their new life together. "I want him to lose everything," she said quietly. "His money, his reputation, his job prospects, his precious partnership. I want him to understand that actions have consequences." Amanda nodded approvingly. "Now you're talking my language. But we need to be smart about this. Scorched earth tactics can backfire if we're not careful. We need to be strategic, methodical, make him think he's getting away with something while we build our case." "What's the first step?" "We file a response to his petition, and we file our own counter-petition with very different terms than what he's proposing. Then we start discovery, demanding. Financial records, emails, phone records, everything. We're going to turn over every rock in his life and see what crawls out." Amanda pulled out a thick folder and began shuffling through forms. "I'm going to need you to sign several documents today. First, a retainer agreement. My rate is $450 an hour, and I'll need a $25,000 retainer to start." Julia didn't blink. It was a significant sum, but she had money in her personal account that Michael didn't know about. Funds from her business that she'd been saving for a surprise renovation of their kitchen. The irony was delicious. Done. What else? Authorization. For me to represent you, financial disclosure forms, and a temporary restraining order, preventing him from disposing of any marital assets. A restraining order? Standard practice in contested divorces, especially when one party has already demonstrated deceptive behavior. We don't want him liquidating investments or transferring money to accounts we can't trace. Amanda handed her a pen. "Trust me, Julia. By the time he realizes what hit him, it'll be too late to cover his tracks." As Julia signed the documents, Amanda outlined their strategic approach. They would demand comprehensive financial discovery, including 3 years of tax returns, bank statements, credit card records, and investment account statements. They would subpoena his employer's records regarding the affair with Sarah. They would hire a forensic accountant to trace any hidden assets or suspicious transactions. "What about the house?" Julia asked. "You're going to stay there, obviously. We'll file for temporary exclusive use and possession of the marital residence. Given that he's the one who initiated the divorce and is presumably living with his girlfriend, a judge will likely grant it. And then we wait for him to make mistakes. And trust me, he will. Men like Michael always do. They get overconfident, they think they've got everything figured out, and they start making sloppy decisions." Amanda gathered the signed documents. "In the meantime, you need to start protecting yourself. Change any passwords he might know. Document everything he says or does. Keep records of all communications." Julia felt a strange mixture of excitement and trepidation. "How long will this take?" "Depends on how reasonable he wants to be. If he's smart, he'll settle quickly and quietly. If he wants to fight..." Amanda shrugged. "I've had cases drag on for 2 years, but honestly, given what you've told me about his personality and his situation with the secretary, I don't think he's going to be reasonable. He's probably feeling pretty confident right now, thinking he holds all the cards. He's wrong about that. Very wrong. And by the time he figures it out, we'll have already dismantled his entire strategy." Amanda stood, signaling the end of their meeting. "I'll have the papers filed by this afternoon. He should be served by tomorrow morning, probably at his office." The thought of Michael being served divorce papers at his prestigious investment firm in front of his colleagues and supervisors gave Julia a deep sense of satisfaction. It wouldn't be nearly as public as his restaurant ambush, but it would be embarrassing enough. "Amanda," Julia said as they walked toward the door, "I want you to know how much I appreciate this, not just as my lawyer, but as my friend." "Julia, honey, this isn't just business for me either. What he did to you was beyond cruel, and I take that personally." Amanda's expression softened for a moment before returning to its professional mask. "Besides, I've been waiting years for a case. Like this. Michael has no idea what he's started, but he's about to find out that some battles aren't worth fighting. Julia left the law office feeling more empowered than she had in months. For the first time since Michael had slid that envelope across the table, she felt like she had some control over her situation. The shock and betrayal were still there, but they were now accompanied by something much more useful: a clear plan for revenge. She drove back to Bellevue with the windows down, letting the crisp autumn air clear her head. There was work to be done, passwords to change, documents to gather, evidence to preserve. Michael thought he'd been clever, planning his exit strategy in secret while she remained oblivious. But he'd made one crucial miscalculation. He'd underestimated not just her intelligence, but her capacity for strategic thinking when backed into a corner. By the time she pulled into her driveway, Julia was already mentally preparing for war. And this was one battle she intended to win. The process server found Michael at 10:47 a.m. on a Wednesday, right in the middle of a client presentation. Julia knew this because Amanda had specifically requested that the papers be served during business hours at his office, and because Sarah, in a moment of poor judgment, had posted a panicked text on her Instagram story. OMG drama at work. Today! The post was deleted within minutes, but Julia had screenshotted it first. Julia herself was in her home office, working on a campaign proposal for a new client, when her phone buzzed with a text from Amanda. Package delivered. Expect fireworks. The fireworks came in the form of 17 missed calls and a barrage of increasingly angry text messages that started arriving around noon. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" was the first one. "My colleagues saw the process server, Julia. This is humiliating. Call off your lawyer. We can work this out ourselves. You're being vindictive and childish." And finally, the one that made her smile. "We need to talk. Tonight. Be reasonable about this." Julia ignored all of them. Amanda had been very clear. No direct communication with Michael, except through attorneys. Every text he sent was potential evidence of harassment, and his increasingly desperate tone suggested their strategy was already working. Instead, she spent the afternoon methodically, gathering the financial records Amanda had requested. Bank statements going back 3 years, tax returns, investment account summaries, credit card bills. She found Michael's old laptop in their home office, and using the password she'd watched him type countless times, logged in to discover a treasure trove of information he'd thought was secure. The most interesting find was a folder labeled Personal that contained screenshots of apartment listings in downtown Seattle. All one-bedroom units, all luxury buildings, all viewed within the past month. One listing had been saved to favorites, a corner unit with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the Space Needle. The rent was $3,200 per month, nearly double what most people paid for their mortgage. Even more telling was his browsing history, which revealed multiple visits to jewelry websites: Tiffany, Cartier, Harry Winston. He'd been looking at engagement rings. Expensive ones. The most recently viewed item was a 2.5-carat diamond solitaire priced at $18,000. Julia printed everything and added it to the growing stack of documents on her kitchen table. Michael wasn't just planning to leave her. He was planning to propose to Sarah. Probably had been for months, while he smiled and made small talk over their morning coffee, while he kissed her goodbye each morning, while he pretended their marriage still mattered. The doorbell rang at 6:30 p.m. Julia checked the security camera and saw Michael standing on their front porch, still in his work clothes but looking decidedly less composed than usual. His tie was loosened, his hair mussed, and his face carried the expression of a man whose carefully laid plans had just exploded in spectacular fashion. She opened the door but left the chain engaged, speaking through the gap. "What do you want?" "Michael? I want to talk to my wife in my own house." His voice was tight with barely controlled anger. "Your wife, maybe. Your house? That's debatable. And according to my attorney, we shouldn't be having direct conversations." Jesus Christ. "Julia, Can you stop being so dramatic? We're adults. We can have a civilized conversation about this. Civilized? Julia laughed, but there was no humor in it. Like the civilized conversation you had with me at the restaurant? The one where you ambushed me with divorce papers on our anniversary? Michael's jaw clenched. I handled that badly. I know that. But this revenge fantasy you're playing out isn't helping anyone. Revenge fantasy? Julia opened the door wider, though she remained positioned to close it quickly if needed. Is that what you think this is? Michael, you served me with divorce papers in a public restaurant. You've been having an affair with your secretary for months. You've been planning your exit strategy while pretending everything was fine. And somehow I'm the one being dramatic? The affair, Sarah and I, it's not what you think, really? Because the email where she talked about starting your new life together seemed pretty clear to me. Michael's face went pale. You went through my emails. I went through our shared computer, which contains community property information that my attorney needs for discovery. But thank you for confirming that there are more emails to find. Look, Michael ran a hand through his hair. I know you're hurt. I know I handled this all wrong. But we can still work this out without involving lawyers and making everything complicated. Julia studied his face, noting the dark circles under his eyes, the tension in his shoulders, the way he kept glancing back at his car as if expecting someone to appear. How did your colleagues react to being served divorce papers at the office? That was unnecessary, Julia. Completely unnecessary. Was it? Because it seems to me that public humiliation was your preferred method of communication. I was just following your lead. Michael's composure finally cracked. God damn it, Julia, I'm trying to be reasonable here. I could have taken half of everything, including your little business, but I'm being generous. I'm letting you keep the house, most of the investments. Letting me? Julia's voice rose. Michael, you don't get to let me keep anything. This is Washington State, community property. Everything gets divided equally, whether you like it or not. Not everything. Not if we can reach an agreement without going to court. An agreement? Julia laughed again. You mean like the agreement where I quietly disappear so you can marry your secretary without any inconvenient complications? Where I pretend the last 10 years didn't happen and walk away with whatever scraps you decide to throw me? It doesn't have to be adversarial. You made it adversarial the moment you decided to cheat on me. You made it adversarial when you chose to humiliate me in public. You want to know what adversarial looks like, Michael? Wait until my forensic accountant starts examining your finances. Wait until we subpoena your employer's records about your relationship with Sarah. Wait until we depose all your colleagues about what they observed at the office. Michael's face went through several color changes. You can't. There are confidentiality issues. Are there? Because employment affairs between supervisors and subordinates are usually considered matters of public interest, especially when they create potential liability for the company. Julia smiled sweetly. Did you know that Sarah could file a sexual harassment claim against both you and your firm? Even consensual relationships can be considered harassment when there's a power imbalance. I'm sure your partners would be very interested to know about that risk. You wouldn't. I wouldn't what? Protect my interests in a divorce that you initiated? Use legal discovery tools that are completely standard in contested divorces? Hold you accountable for decisions you made? Michael stared at her for a long moment, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. You've changed, Julia. This isn't like you. You're right, she said quietly. The old Julia would have begged you to work things out. The old Julia would have blamed herself for whatever problems drove you to cheat. The old Julia would have quietly accepted whatever terms you offered just to avoid conflict. She paused, letting that sink in. But the old Julia didn't know what you were capable of. The old Julia still believed she was married to a man with integrity. Michael's phone buzzed, and he glanced at it automatically. Julia caught a glimpse of Sarah's name on the screen before he shoved it back in his pocket. "She's waiting for you, isn't she?" Julia asked, probably wondering how the conversation with the crazy ex-wife is going. "You should get back to her, Michael. But do me a favor. Tell her that the woman whose marriage she helped destroy isn't going to make things easy for either of you." Michael opened his mouth to respond, then seemed to think better of it. He turned and walked back to his car without another word, his shoulders rigid with frustration and something that might have been fear. Julia watched him drive away, then closed and locked the door. Her hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, but from adrenaline. The conversation had gone exactly as Amanda had predicted it would. Michael had tried intimidation, then bargaining, then threats. When none of that worked, he'd resorted to emotional manipulation, trying to make her feel guilty for protecting herself. But she wasn't the same woman who had sat in that restaurant 4 days ago, blindsided and humiliated. That woman would have crumbled under his disapproval, would have apologized for making things difficult, would have accepted whatever terms he offered just to avoid his anger. This woman, the one who had just stood her ground against his attempts at manipulation, was someone new. Someone who understood that kindness without boundaries was just weakness, that compromise without respect was just surrender. Her phone rang. "Amanda. How did it go?" her lawyer asked without preamble. "Better than expected. He's rattled. He tried to convince me to call you off. Offered to let me keep the house and most of the investments if I agreed to an uncontested divorce." "Of course he did. What did you say?" "I told him that wasn't his decision to make, and I may have mentioned the possibility of Sarah filing a sexual harassment claim." Amanda laughed. "You're learning. What was his reaction?" "Pure panic. I think he's starting to realize that this isn't going to be the quick, quiet exit he planned." "Good. I filed our counter-petition today, by the way. We're asking for spousal support, temporary exclusive use of the residence, attorney fees, and a 50-50 split of all marital assets, including his future partnership interest." "His partnership interest?" "If he makes partner while we're still legally married, that partnership has value that was earned during the marriage. We can claim a portion of it." Julia felt a rush of satisfaction. He's going to hate that. He's going to hate all of it. Which reminds me, I got a call from his attorney this afternoon, Richard Crenshaw from Morrison & Associates. He wants to schedule a settlement conference. Already? Already. Which tells me that Michael is getting pressure from somewhere, probably his employer, possibly Sarah, maybe both. People who want messy situations to go away quickly. What do you think? I think we hold our ground. We've got discovery requests to send, depositions to schedule, and a forensic accountant to hire. Let them sweat for a while. Desperate people make bad decisions, and bad decisions are good for us. After hanging up with Amanda, Julia poured herself a glass of wine and sat in her living room, looking around at the home she'd decorated with such care over the years. The custom curtains she'd spent months selecting, the artwork they'd bought together during their trip to Italy, the built-in bookshelves that held their combined collection of novels and travel guides. It had all felt so permanent just a week ago. Now it seemed like pieces of evidence in a legal proceeding, assets to be valued and divided. But instead of sadness, Julia felt a strange sense of liberation. For the first time in years, she wasn't trying to hold together something that was broken. She wasn't making excuses for someone else's behavior or pretending problems didn't exist. She was finally, truly, fighting for herself. 3 months later, Julia sat in the conference room at Amanda's law firm, watching Michael's attorney shuffle through a stack of papers with the resigned expression of a man who knew he was fighting a losing battle. The conference room itself was an imposing space, with a table that could seat 20 people and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked Elliott Bay. On clear days like today, you could see all the way to the San Juan Islands, the same islands, where Julia had planned to take Michael for their anniversary surprise, a trip that now felt like it belonged to a different lifetime entirely. Across the table, Michael looked like he'd aged 5 years in the past 12 weeks. His usually perfect hair showed signs of gray at the temples that she'd never noticed before, and his expensive suit, one she'd helped him pick out for a company dinner just 6 months ago, couldn't hide the weight he'd clearly lost. The confident, self-assured man who had slid divorce papers across a restaurant table was gone, replaced by someone who looked haunted and defeated. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his hands trembled slightly when he reached for his water glass. The forensic. Accounting had been devastating for his case, even more thorough and damaging than Amanda had initially predicted. Not only had they uncovered the apartment he'd been secretly financing for Sarah, paid for with funds from their joint savings account over a period of 8 months, but they'd also discovered a pattern of financial deception that went back nearly 2 years. Credit cards Julia hadn't known about, used for expensive dinners and weekend getaways to places like Vancouver and Portland. A safety deposit box rented under his name alone at a bank in Redmond, containing documents related to investments he'd hidden from her, including stock options from a previous job that he'd never mentioned. Most damning of all, evidence that he'd been systematically moving money into accounts she couldn't access, building a nest egg for his post-divorce life while she remained completely unaware of his plans. The paper trail was extensive and meticulously documented by their forensic accountant, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Wong, who had built her reputation by uncovering hidden assets in high-stakes divorce cases. Patricia had traced every suspicious transaction, cataloged every unexplained expense, and presented it all in a comprehensive report that read like a masterclass in financial betrayal. The total amount of money Michael had attempted to hide was staggering. Nearly $73,000 in cash and investments that should have been disclosed as marital property. The partnership situation has become complicated, Richard Crenshaw, Michael's attorney, was saying in the carefully neutral tone that lawyers used when delivering bad news. As we discussed, the firm has decided to postpone Mr. Harrison's partnership consideration indefinitely, pending the resolution of certain HR issues. Julia didn't bother to hide her smile. The HR issues had materialized exactly as Amanda predicted, once the firm's partners learned about Michael's relationship with Sarah. The investigation had revealed not just the affair, but also evidence that Michael had used his position to secure Sarah a promotion and salary increase that she wasn't qualified for. The firm was now facing potential liability issues, and Michael's dreams of partnership had evaporated along with his reputation. Furthermore, Crenshaw continued, there's the matter of Mr. Harrison's employment status. The firm has indicated that they may be restructuring his position. Restructuring, Amanda repeated with mock sympathy. That's a polite way of saying he's being fired, isn't it? Michael's face flushed red, but he remained silent. He'd learned, through several painful depositions, that speaking up only made things worse for his case. My client is prepared to make a final settlement offer, Crenshaw said, pulling out a document that he slid across the table to Amanda. We believe this represents a fair resolution that takes into account all parties' interests. Amanda scanned the document quickly, her expression carefully neutral. Julia had learned to read her lawyer's poker face over the past months. The slight tightening around her eyes meant the offer was better than expected, but still not good enough. Let's see, Amanda said aloud, as if reading the terms for the first time. Mr. Harrison is offering to relinquish all claim to the marital residence, valued at $1.2 million. He's agreeing to a 50-50 split of all investment accounts and retirement funds. He's offering 3 years of spousal support at $4,000 per month. She looked up at Michael. And he's agreeing to pay my client's attorney fees, which currently total $67,000. That's a generous offer, Crenshaw said hopefully. It's the same offer we rejected 6 weeks ago, Amanda replied coolly, before we discovered the hidden accounts, the secret apartment, and the fraudulent financial transfers, before we learned about the sexual harassment investigation at his firm, before we documented a pattern of financial deception that lasted nearly 2 years. She set the document aside. My client's position hasn't changed. Full disclosure of all assets, including the accounts he tried to hide. 5 years of spousal support at $5,000 per month, reflecting his reduced earning capacity due to his employment situation. The marital residence, plus 50% of all marital assets, including the funds he illegally transferred to secret accounts, and attorney fees, which are now approaching $80,000. Michael finally spoke, his voice hoarse with frustration. "This is insane, Julia. You're destroying both of us out of spite." Julia looked at him for a long moment before responding. "I'm not destroying anything, Michael. I'm simply refusing to let you profit from betraying me. You spent 2 years lying to me, stealing from our joint accounts, and planning your exit strategy while I believed we were building a life together. Did you really think there wouldn't be consequences? We could have worked this out quietly. We could have been reasonable adults about this. We could have been reasonable adults about our marriage problems before you decided to cheat on me with your secretary," Julia replied. "We could have been reasonable adults when you had concerns about our relationship, instead of you plotting your escape behind my back. We could have been reasonable adults when you served me divorce papers in a restaurant on our anniversary." Michael's face crumpled slightly. "I know I handled things badly. I know I hurt you. But this is destroying my entire life." "Your entire life?" Julia's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. "Michael, you're losing half of assets that legally belong to me anyway. You're paying spousal support that any judge would award, based on the length of our marriage and your financial deception. You're covering attorney fees that you made necessary by hiding assets and lying during discovery. None of this is punishment. It's just the natural consequence of the choices you made," Amanda interjected smoothly. "And let's not forget that my client is being quite generous by not pursuing a civil case for the fraudulent financial transfers. She could sue for the full amount of money you moved to hidden accounts, plus damages and additional attorney fees." Crenshaw's face went pale. "Civil case? Moving marital assets to secret accounts during divorce proceedings is considered financial fraud in Washington state," Amanda explained patiently. "It's a felony that carries both criminal penalties and civil liability. We have documentation of $47,000 in transfers that Mr. Harrison attempted to hide from discovery." Michael slumped in his chair. Julia almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Then she remembered the cold smile on his face when he'd slid those papers across the restaurant table, and her sympathy evaporated. "What about Sarah?" Michael asked suddenly. "What happens to her in all this?" "What happens to Sarah is not my client's concern," Amanda said. "Though I understand she's retained her own attorney regarding the workplace harassment issues. Apparently, your firm's HR investigation uncovered some interesting details about how she received her promotion and salary increase." Julia had heard through Amanda's network that Sarah was indeed facing her own legal troubles. The promotion Michael had secured for her was now being questioned. Her salary increase was being reversed, and she was likely to be terminated for violating the company's fraternization policy. The woman who had helped destroy Julia's marriage was learning that actions had consequences for her as well. "I need to discuss this with my client," Crenshaw said finally, gathering his papers. "We'll need some time to consider your terms." "Of course," Amanda said graciously. "Take all the time you need, though I should mention that my client is prepared to go to trial if necessary. We have a very strong case, and frankly, the publicity wouldn't be particularly favorable to Mr. Harrison or his employment prospects." After Michael and his lawyer left, Julia and Amanda sat in the conference room, sharing a bottle of sparkling water and reviewing their victory. "How do you feel?" Amanda asked. Julia considered the question carefully. "Satisfied," she said finally. "Not happy. I never wanted any of this to happen. But satisfied that I fought for myself, that I didn't let him walk all over me." "He'll accept the terms," Amanda said confidently. "He can't afford not to. His employment situation is precarious. His reputation is shot, and we have enough evidence of financial misconduct to pursue criminal charges if we wanted to. He's out of options. Julia nodded. What happens next? Next, you start your new life. You'll have the house, enough money to be comfortable, and the knowledge that you stood up for yourself when it mattered most. 2 weeks later, Julia stood in her newly renovated kitchen, supervising the installation of the custom cabinets she'd finally been able to afford. The divorce settlement had been finalized the previous week. Michael had accepted their terms exactly as Amanda predicted, signing the papers in a brief, silent ceremony that was the complete opposite of their wedding day 10 years earlier. The $5,000 monthly spousal support would continue for 5 years, giving Julia financial security while she built her consulting business into something even more substantial. The house was entirely hers now, along with half of their investment portfolio, all of her retirement accounts, and even a portion of the hidden funds Michael had tried to conceal. The kitchen renovation was something she'd dreamed about for years, but had never pursued while married to Michael, who had always found reasons to postpone home improvements. Now, watching the contractors install sleek quartz countertops and custom-built storage solutions, Julia felt a deep sense of satisfaction that went far beyond the aesthetic improvements. This was her space now, designed according to her preferences, paid for with her money, and maintained on her timeline. More importantly, she had something she hadn't possessed in years: complete control over her own life. No more checking with someone else before making decisions. No more compromising on things that mattered to her. No more walking on eggshells around someone's unpredictable moods. The silence in her house was peaceful rather than tense, and she'd discovered that she actually enjoyed living alone more than she'd ever imagined possible. Michael had moved to Portland 3 weeks after the settlement was finalized, apparently, having secured a position at a smaller investment firm at a significantly reduced salary. The job market for disgraced financial advisors wasn't particularly robust, especially for someone carrying the baggage of a sexual harassment investigation and a messy public divorce. His new employer was a regional firm that handled middle market clients, a significant step down from the prestigious Seattle company, where he'd spent the previous 8 years building his reputation. Sarah had been terminated from her job and was reportedly working as a receptionist at a dental office in Bothell. A far cry from the executive assistant position she'd leveraged her relationship with Michael to obtain. Their fairy tale romance had crumbled under the weight of financial stress and legal troubles, exactly as Julia had predicted it would. Love built on deception and betrayal, she'd learned, rarely survived when exposed to the harsh light of real-world consequences. The last Julia had heard, Sarah was living in a studio apartment and taking night classes to become a certified medical assistant, trying to rebuild a career that had been derailed by her poor judgment. Julia's phone buzzed with a text from Amanda. Saw the article in Seattle Business Journal about your new client contracts. Congratulations on the success. Julia smiled, looking at the framed article on her counter. Her marketing consultancy had landed 3 major accounts in the past month, including a tech startup that was about to go public. Her business was thriving, in ways it never had, when she was distracted by trying to hold together a failing marriage. The doorbell rang, and Julia opened it to find a delivery man holding an enormous bouquet of flowers. Julia Harrison? Actually, she said, accepting the flowers. It's Julia Morrison now. I went back to my maiden name. The card was from her sister. Congratulations on your new life. You're an inspiration to us all. As Julia arranged the flowers, in a vase, one she'd bought herself, in colors she loved, for the home that was entirely hers, she reflected on the incredible journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a woman who defined herself primarily through her relationship with a man who was secretly planning to leave her. She had been someone who avoided conflict at all costs, who made excuses for other people's bad behavior, who prioritized keeping the peace over protecting herself. She'd been the type of person who apologized when others bumped into her, who accepted less than she deserved because asking for more felt too aggressive. That woman was gone, replaced by someone stronger, wiser, and infinitely more self-assured. The betrayal that had nearly destroyed her had ultimately become the catalyst for her transformation into the person she was always meant to be, but had been too afraid or too conditioned to become. She'd discovered reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed, learned to advocate for herself with a fierceness that surprised even her closest friends, and developed a clear sense of her own worth that no one could ever take away again. The legal battle had been exhausting, expensive, and emotionally draining, but it had also been educational in ways she never could have anticipated. She'd learned about forensic accounting, asset protection, and the intricate ways that Washington state's community property laws worked to protect spouses from financial abuse. She'd discovered that she had excellent instincts for strategy and negotiation, skills that had served her well, not just in the divorce proceedings, but also in growing her business. Julia walked out onto her back deck, looking over the garden she was planning to redesign this spring with the help of a landscape architect she'd consulted the previous week. The plans included raised beds for vegetables, a greenhouse for year-round growing, and a meditation space with a small fountain where she could practice the mindfulness techniques she'd learned during the most stressful parts of the divorce process. The Seattle skyline glittered in the distance, full of possibilities she hadn't even begun to explore. For the first time in years, the future felt entirely her own, unlimited by someone else's expectations or limitations. She'd started dating, again, cautiously and on her own terms, meeting interesting people through her expanded social circle and professional networks. There was David, the environmental lawyer she'd met at a networking event who shared her love of hiking and sustainable living. There was Marcus, the chef who'd catered one of her client events and who made her laugh until her sides hurt. Neither relationship was serious yet, but they reminded her that romance didn't have to involve sacrifice, compromise of her values, or walking on eggshells around someone's fragile ego. She raised her wine glass in a toast to herself, to survival, to strength, to the hard-won knowledge that sometimes the worst thing that can happen to you turns out to be exactly what you needed. Michael had given her divorce papers instead of an anniversary gift, thinking he was taking her life away, destroying the comfortable existence they'd built together. Instead, he had given her the greatest gift of all, the opportunity to discover who she really was when she stopped trying to be who everyone else wanted her to be, the opportunity to build a life based on her own values and priorities, rather than constantly accommodating someone else's needs and expectations, the opportunity to pursue her own dreams without having to justify or defend them to a partner who had never truly supported her ambitions. Julia thought about the woman she'd been a year ago, always checking her phone for Michael's approval, before making decisions, always worrying about his moods and reactions, always putting his comfort before her own needs. That woman had been diminished, reduced to a supporting role in her own life story. She'd been so focused on being a good wife that she'd forgotten how to be herself. Now, standing in her own garden with a glass of wine in her hand and the Seattle skyline twinkling in the distance, Julia felt a profound sense of completion. Not the completion that comes from finding another person to fill an empty space, but the completion that comes from finally becoming whole on your own terms. She'd learned that she didn't need someone else's validation to feel worthy, didn't need someone else's presence to feel complete, didn't need someone else's approval to make choices about her own life. The journey had been painful beyond anything she could have imagined when Michael first slid those papers across the restaurant table. There had been nights when she'd cried until she was physically exhausted, days when she'd questioned every decision she'd ever made, moments when she'd wondered if fighting back was worth the emotional and financial cost. But every tear had been worth it. Every sleepless night had led to this moment of absolute certainty about who she was and what she deserved. And that woman, Julia realized with deep satisfaction and a growing sense of excitement about the future, was magnificent. She was strong enough to stand alone, smart enough to protect herself, and wise enough to know that the best relationships were partnerships between two complete people, rather than desperate attempts to fill each other's empty spaces. She finished her wine and walked back into her house, her sanctuary, her investment, her own carefully curated space, feeling grateful for every difficult lesson that had brought her to this point. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new possibilities she couldn't even imagine yet. But tonight, she was exactly where she belonged, home with herself, whole and unbroken, and ready for whatever came next.